A Brexit deal is close. On Tuesday morning, British Prime Minister Theresa May's cabinet was invited to inspect a draft text of the withdrawal agreement between Britain and the European Union, which was 95% agreed. The shape of a compromise around the future of the Irish border, the only outstanding element in the talks, is also emerging. As things stand, the cabinet is due to meet again early next week, and then to instruct Britain's negotiators to go to Brussels and finish the job. The anticipation is such that the government's supposed media plan to sell the deal to the nation was leaked to the BBC and other outlets earlier this week. The narrative should be one of measured success, the note said. But won't be all champagne corks popping. Downing Street denied that the document was the official plan, but the note rang with an exhaustion that sounded real enough. Historic moment, it concluded, in block capitals. Your own interests aside, put the country's interests first and back this deal, if you voted for Britain to remain in the EU. In the summer of 2016, it is hard to get excited now about the precise terms of departure. Conversely, many of those who voted for Brexit have also been dismayed by the 16 months of grim, technical negotiations with Brussels and the compromises that the UK has been forced to concede. Over the weekend, Boris Johnson, the national Brexit cheerleader and former Foreign Secretary, described May's almost done deal as an absolute stinker and a national humiliation. Johnson is nowhere near the extreme of the Conservative Party's anti-EU wing, whose members must decide in the coming weeks whether to support the government's version of Brexit or to try and wreck it in Parliament in the hope of bringing about a more victorious departure. On Thursday morning, I had coffee with Bernard Jenkin, the Tory MP for Harwich in North Essex, who has campaigned against the terms of Britain's EU membership since 1992. Jenkin, who is 59, met me in the tall atrium of Portcullis House, which adjoins the Palace of Westminster, and where MPs and their aides were preparing for another day of Brexit hair-tugging and head-shaking. We are at a moment of great political crisis, he told me. And, as in most political crises, everyone is losing their heads. The great fear among true Brexiteers is that, even after leaving the EU, Britain will not be free. They can't stand any lingering entanglements with the bloc, but May has suggested a common rulebook for British and European goods and agricultural products to facilitate trade in the future. The working solution to the problem of having a border on the island of Ireland, meanwhile, is for Britain to stay inside the EU's customs union until someone comes up with a better idea. The final, grueling inches in the negotiations have been devoted to making sure that the Irish backstop, as it is known, is not a permanent state of affairs. Another senior Brexit campaigner I spoke to this week said that as long as there is a time limit, or a means to renegotiate the backstop at some point, Conservative MPs will be able to vote for May's deal with a bit of dignity. When I put this to Jenkin, he laughed quietly. Hopelessly naive, he said. Jenkin is the son of a baron, amusing and polite. Like most fervent Eurosceptics, he also has a Jansenist clarity. I have never known a government conduct anything so incompetently, he said. Nobody knows how many Conservative MPs will be willing to vote against Britain's deal with the EU, and to risk the potential calamities, economic chaos, a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government, that might ensue. With the support of her fractious allies the Northern Irish Democratic Unionist Party, May officially has a working majority of 13 in the House of Commons. But she faces threats from both pro-Remain and pro-Leave sides of her party. On Friday afternoon, Boris Johnson's younger brother Joe, the country's Minister for Transport, who voted Remain, resigned from the government and announced that he would vote against May's plan. On the Brexiteer side, estimates of the number of potential Tory rebels go as high as 60. Almost all are members of a faction called the European Research Group, which is chaired by Jacob Rees-Mogg, the party's right-wing darling, and coordinated by WhatsApp. I am astonished how solid our numbers are, Jenkin told me. And the sense is that the government is simply not listening. The other Brexit campaigner I spoke to believed that only around half of the ERG, about 25 MPs, would have the nerve to sabotage the government's withdrawal deal in the end, but that is more than enough to cause serious trouble. Which is what the anti-EU plotters have been up to for about a quarter of a century. They brought down the party's last Prime Minister, David Cameron, terrorized his predecessor, John Major, and now they have their eye on a third. If May's tentative agreement with Brussels falls apart, either because of a last-minute hitch in the talks or, more likely, a blow-up in the House of Commons, then the likeliest outcome is that the UK will leave the bloc with no deal at all. A no-deal Brexit is predicted to cause a severe economic shock and shortages of food, fuel, and medical supplies. I am perfectly prepared to accept there will be some friction and bumps, Jenkins said. Arch-Brexiteers see leaving the EU as a moment of national rebirth, in which Britain can find its way back to a path that it abandoned at the end of the Cold War when Margaret Thatcher fell. There is bound to be some pain along the way. With this in mind, they find it almost impossible to talk about Brexit without referring to the country's previous military or moral successes. Jenkins compared May's negotiations with the EU to Neville Chamberlain's diplomatic dealings with Hitler. Colleagues are saying, "Do you think this is what it felt like during the appeasement crisis?" he said. Andrew Bridgen, an MP from Leicestershire and fellow ERG member, described the Prime Minister as a doomed soldier. "She is like an isolated pillbox surrounded by the enemy but just keeping on firing," he said. Despite the fact that it is pretty clear that she is going to get overwhelmed, the government will do everything it can to force the anti-EU rebels into line. Jenkins told me that he was braced for dire warnings from the Treasury, among others. "Oh, we are going to have the full fear campaign again," he said. The Sunday Times of London reported that some Tory backbenchers have taken to keeping their mobile devices inside microwave ovens in their offices, to prevent electronic eavesdropping by the deep state. "There are people in the ERG who believe that their phones are being listened to," Bridgen told me. When I asked him if he was one of them, he said, "I always remember the old adage, just because you're paranoid, doesn't mean they are not out to get you." Jenkins didn't want to discuss bugging. "I don't know what happens to your phone when you put it in a microwave," he said. He was focused on the next stage of the real Brexiteers' long slog to recast Britain's place in the world. "I try and stay above it all," Jenkins said. I asked him what he was planning to do during the coming showdown in Parliament. "Gently and calmly keep on articulating the truth," he replied.